Hello, students from Sustainable Future Series in Complutense University. My name is Shiana Sotelo, Associate Professor in English Studies Department, Faculty of Philology, and a member of the Institute of Feminist Studies in Complutense University. I'm also the coordinator of the Eurasia Foundation Burgos University course titled Sustainable Relations and Dialogues with an Eurasia Community in a Post-COVID-19 World. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you very much to Professor Asuncion Lopez Varela for the invitation to participate. My lecture today is framed within the Sustainable Goal number 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. And my presentation will be structured in two main blocks. On the one hand, I would like to provide a general overview of the state of the developing goal number 5 in an international and a European Union context. I would also like to review the emphasis of the United Nations and the European Union on stressing the fact that this gender equality should be achieved by all women and girls, stressing diversity, complexity, and multiplicity. We'll also look at how the gender equality strategy is based on intersectionality, which is a feminist concept, a feminist methodology that has been embraced in the last decades by international institutions such as United Nations and the European Union, embracing its potential to address diversity and inclusion. And then in the last block, I would like to provide just one example, two examples actually. One has to do with interrogating what we can do as university teachers, professors, students, faculty in general to help advance the Sustainable Development Goal from our own disciplines and our own fields of study. And also to provide a brief example of a service learning project that we are actually implemented in the research group SIM. The first interrogation, what we can do as students and university professors, will be revolving around the need to develop critical thinking skills to provide an objective and contrasted discussion about gender equality, and also to understand the roots and the origin of this discrimination. Okay, so let's get started. The year 2020 marked the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Beijing Declaration, and the Platform for Action would really mark the beginning of the most encompassing, coordinated effort to promote at an international level a set of policies and action plans to ensure gender equality at an international level. Last year, 2021, United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, released the Sustainable Developing Goals report, which I am going to briefly summarize, stresses the need to continue fighting gender inequalities, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic has really exacerbated these inequalities and actually threatens to undermine the progress that has been made in the last decades. The first action that needs to be taken is to stop the intensification of violence. Violence against women persists at unacceptable high levels and has been intensified by the pandemic. Actually, nearly 1 in 3 women, we're talking about 730 million women in the world, have been subjected to physical or sexual violence at least once in their lifetime, especially since they were teenagers, because domestic abuse, which is undertaken by an intimate partner, starts really early. I would like also to highlight the fact that at this point in 2022, despite progress, there is no country in the world, no country that is on track to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls by 2030. So that is also a lot to reflect in that. There is, due to the pandemic, there is an increase in child marriage. And let's also reflect about how child marriage, which is the practice of marrying underage girls, is really normalized in many countries and traditions. Before the pandemic, there was a slight decline. We're talking about 15% married as children decreased, from nearly 1 into 4 from 1 into 5 to 1 into 4, but that has reversed due to the epidemic. Many factors included economic shocks, lockdown, school closures, interruptions in reproductive health services. So that is really a big problem. Over the next decade, up to 10 million more girls are expected to be at risk of child marriage due to the epidemic, adding to the 100 million who were projected to become child brides before. Another issue that is a stress is that the pandemic is adding burden of women's unpaid work while squeezing them out of the labor force. As United Nations report demonstrates, I mean, the majority of women across the world spend 2.5 times many hours on unpaid domestic work and care work as men. And this is data from 90 countries collected between 21 and 2019. So of course, they both, women and men, have increased their unpaid workloads due to the epidemic. But what is a reality, and that what the statistics show, is that women are doing disproportionate share. This is a study of 16 countries, and so it shows the amount of time spent on childcare has increased for women and men, but for women from 26 hours a week to before pandemic to 31 after, and for men it's from 20 hours to 24 hours, so 24 hours. Yeah. That is also another big problem to take into account. And then there women equal participation in decision making that is crucial for the COVID-19 response and recovery effort really remains a distant target. As for the 1st of January 2021, women representation in a global scale is really far from parity. As we're going to see here in this chart, this is data from many different continents, and we see a very pervasive trend that is still not even reaching the 40% globally speaking, right? And then the last 2 points that I would like to highlight on the one hand is the persistence of many discriminatory laws that are preventing women from exercising their human rights. Access to many different social and civil areas. And we're talking about 80% of the countries in this study did include some kind of budget to implement legislation addressing violence against women. But out of these countries, 60% lacked any type of rape laws based on the principle of consent, for example. And even though many of these countries do not have discriminatory laws when it comes to employment, however, almost half of these do continue to have restrictions to women from working in certain jobs or industries. And finally, it's important to take into account that giving women equal access to land would really go a long way towards alleviating poverty and food insecurity. And as you can see in this next chart, mostly based on the continent of Africa and Asia, there is still a long way to go to find equal access to land for women. In the particular context of the European Union, we find that, the European Union, once the pandemic started, signed a statement supported by 146 United Nations members calling for zero tolerance towards gender-based and domestic violence, recognizing the role of women in the fight against COVID-19. Their initiative that is currently implemented is called Striving for a Union of Equality, the Gender Equality Strategy 2020-2025. As the president of the European Union, President Ursula von der Leyen says, quote, "Gender equality is a core principle of the European Union, but is still it is not yet a reality. In business, politics, and society as a whole, we can only reach our full potential if we use all our talent and diversity. Using half of the population, half of the ideas, half of the energy is not good enough. Remember that the European Union guarantees non-discrimination and promotion of equality on its Article 8 of the Treaty of the European Union, the chapter of the fundamental rights, and it says, quote, "In all its activities, the Union shall aim to eliminate inequalities to promote equality between men and women," unquote. So that is what this initiative wants to help implement, right? A gender equal Europe where everybody, not just women and girls, but everybody is free to pursue and choose their own path in life. However, if we look at the figures, in 2022, 33% of women in the European Union have experienced physical or sexual violence at least once in their lifetime. We're talking about 22% of women have experienced this violence at the hands of an intimate partner. And 55% of women in the European Union have been sexually harassed, and they're more likely to experience online sexual harassment than men. So, of course, when it comes to the implementations of the European Union, one has already been implemented by the end of 2020, which is demanding pay transparency for companies and institutions, and also reinforcing gender discriminatory laws to prevent domestic violence. And also, the clarifying internet platforms' role in addressing all this harmful content, sexist content, and also challenging gender stereotypes in society, which is a very important aspect. I would like to come back when I give you the example of what we work in the research group SIM. So also, when it comes to the participation in the European Union of women and girls, and when it comes to thrive in society and the economy, we have that currently women in the European Union earn on average 16% less than men per hour. And only 67% of women in the European Union are unemployed compared to 78% of men. And then that also reflects in the women's pensions, where are on average 30% less than men's. And what we talked about before, the disproportionate share of the domestic work, there is 70% of the unpaid care and unpaid domestic work in the European Union is done by men. What actions are trying to be implemented? Well, the same as I said before, equal paid, and implementing equal paid and making sure the work and life balance, which means that promoting equal uptake of family leaves, flexible working arrangements, and also, of course, improving access to high quality and affordable childcare that will really alleviate the domestic and unpaid work for women. In an ideal European Union, we will see that they're equal, women and men's lead at the same level in economy and society. However, the current figures demonstrate that only 7.5% of board chairs and 7.7% of CEOs in the European Union are women. And also when it comes to technological and STEM careers, only 22% of artificial intelligence programmers are women, which is a very, very low percentage. And also 39% of members of the European Parliament are women. So when it comes to policies to improve the situation, the European Union talks about including demanding companies to have this board and politic parity, Also, just to provide a gender balance on the corporate boards, also encourage the participation of women as voters and as candidates in the 2024 European Parliament elections, and really addressing diversity in all sectors of the European Union. So to understand gender equality strategy for both the United Nations and the European Union, it's necessary to comprehend, well, first of all, when we refer to gender, which is a feminist gender theory concept, we refer to all the rules, all the attitudes, the values that have been assigned, that have been imposed by patriarchal traditions to women, and to women and men, to all different collectives. So just because they are born in a particular sex. So gender does not designate natural characteristics of women or men, but makes visible all these series of assumptions of what a woman or a man is, or how a woman, a girl in this case, should behave just for being a woman or just for being a girl. So fighting against gender discriminatory gender roles is necessary in all areas of life, not just in one area. And for that, one of the most important characteristics of this gender equality strategy is understood to be gender mainstreaming, which is that, as it says in the slide, it needs to be included in all policy areas, in all different sectors, and to address in all the challenges of the European Union must be included how we tackle gender equality. And as we can see, approach as an analytical and theoretical paradigm, intersectionality is here described as all women are different and all women face discrimination on several characteristics, not just on the fact that they are women. For instance, immigrant women with a disability may suffer discrimination on 3 grounds: discrimination for being a woman, for discrimination for being immigrant, and discrimination for having a disability. Intersectionality implies the awareness that we cannot talk in general terms and we cannot apply policies and actions in general terms. We need to be as specific. However, it's not a term that many people really understand what it means and stands for. And I will try to briefly explain that. Intersectionality as a feminist theory methodology for research really makes visible how identities are not homogeneous. We are multiple, complex, multi-layer, multi-dimensional individuals, and where our genders are based on this set of sexual assumptions are intersecting with many other social categories, not just our sex, our ethnicity, our class. And so the term that it was officially coined in the late 80s, in 1989, by an African-American feminist lawyer, Kimberly Crenshaw. However, its roots its conceptual roots go all the way back to the 19th century, the first decades of the 19th century in the United States. And it's first articulated by the anti-slavery movement and its leaders to eradicate the slavery of millions of African descendants. As we can see in the publications of the day, they proclaim liberty to all, right? Not just to the norm, the specific norm that the Declaration of Independence projected. As you can see in this image, the idea of intersectionality is first articulated in the publications of these leaders. For example, the Liberator. It was one of the papers published by William George Harrison, which was one of the leaders of the the anti-slavery movement. And in the latest department section, you can see this interpolation that oppression is not just for being a woman. And they're using the African and American woman as a slave to ask, I'm not a woman and a sister. Of course, it's like the fact that I'm African descendant does not make me less of a woman. And also the idea that all these, the ideology that was driving the day was Christian values and Christian ideologies. So interpolating the fact that also Africans were Christians. So this is the beginning, the interpolation of identity in the intersection of ethnicity and class. Here she is a slave, the recognition that oppression that is multidimensional. Also, the intersectional claims in terms of historical records in a gender feminist context are firstly found in Sojourner Truth. She was a runaway slave and became an emblematic figure in the anti-abolition movement. And she publicly challenged the European descendants, so-called white feminists, to respond to what extent they could accommodate the experience of slavery into the condition of being a woman. In her speech, for example, she defiantly asked, in the context how the discussion was that women as ladies needed to be treated in a different way, she says, quote, "The man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody helps me any best place. And I a woman?" So this first intersectional interpolation is later developed after the civil rights movement in the 1970s by a group of African-American lesbian feminists that issued a Black feminist statement that we call the Combahee River Collective. And as you can see in the quote, they say, "We are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of an integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. So the synthesis of these oppressions creates the conditions of our life." So this is the first time that it's articulated the need to look at all these different layers of our identity as interlocking, as relational. And that is completely opposite to the mainstream gender theory of the time, in which gender was seen as the basis and all the other categories were added. So this is the first interpolation of an intersectional need to approach identity. This is also developed not just by African Americans, by Chicanas, with the concept of the brown woman. As Garcia Nieto says, "No one can deny that we all are women, but neither can we deny that we are not the same. The many of us have not shared in the gains made in the name of a woman in this country. Chicanas share with the Blacks and other visible minority women many gifts and benefits enjoyed as a matter of course by white women." Also by Marta Cotera in the 1974. She says, "The brown woman, she wonders what the hell is meant when the white women say we're all alike." So as you can see here, all these different differences were seen as a source of separation. They all, the most brilliant articulation of intersectionality, even though the concept was not coined still, but you find intersectional theories, intersectional identities in the groundbreaking publication of the first women of color anthology in the United States, "This Bridge Called My Back," writings by radical women of color, edited by the Chicanas Cherie Moraga and Gloria Alzandua. And they become the spokespeople, the spokeswomen of millions of women whose personal stories and experiences were completely different than mainstream European middle-class heterosexual women. That was the gender theory that dominated feminist theories and works in US and European academia in the 80s. So they give voice to identities impacted by colonization, slavery, sexual discrimination, many different types of social exclusion. And so they color themselves consciously to defend the need to have a voice. And so they magnified these differences in order to make visible the gender interlocking social categories and to recognize that racism, classism, and all the other forms of discrimination within feminism on ranks. As we see in this quote, they say, in the introduction of the first anthology, in the first edition, 1981, quote, We want to express to all women, especially white middle-class women, experiences which divide us. We want to examine incidents of intolerance, prejudice, denial of differences. We want to explore the causes and sources and solutions to these divisions. So as we see here, intersectionality is the awareness that we cannot deny our differences. We need to recognize the differences, acknowledge that every person, not just from a situation of discrimination, but also of privilege, has a particular intersectional equation. And this is important in the sense that the concept of intersectionality has evolved within gender women's studies since the 80s until the beginning of the 20th century, understanding that this concept of intersectionality not only belongs to women and girls or people in general who suffer situations of discrimination, but also applies to situations of privilege. You can see here that this shows that, as as a visual snapshot, how at the center we have our gender identities, which is all the rules, beliefs, set of norms that we're supposed to do, behave, and act as being born in a sex body, as having the sex of a female, right? However, there is this recognition that all our identities are multidimensional and they are continually intersecting with so many different categories, many other categories: our age, our ethnicity, our occupation, our sexual orientation, our immigrant status, many different categories, right? And these categories cannot just simply be added to our gender, but are continually intersecting. I think this is a very clear image of what intersectionality is about. And again, it's to stop colonizing and diversity and multiplicity of experiences. Women all should always be approached in plural terms and multiple terms. Another image to understand intersectionality is that to comprehend that it really allows all women and girls and men to feel proud and comfortable of themselves as a whole, not just having to choose between one part or one particular identity. Without intersectionality, only one part, which is the legally accepted by society, can be claimed. But as I said, the recognition that our experiences are situated and we cannot generalize, it's a plea for equality to all, right? To stop colonizing and stop invisibilizing different aspects of people's identities. Also, as the African American feminist writer, theorist, poetess Audre Lorde reminds us, gender equality cannot be achieved as a single issue struggle, because there is no such as because our lives are not single issue lives, right? We are impacted by so many different things, not just by our sex, by our class, our sexual orientation, our age. So many different things impact our identity as women and girls. Also, the potential to intersectionality is not only just to stop colonizing women's experiences or people's experiences. C2A knowledge is about inclusivity and diversity, but it's also about the possibility of strategic alliances, as we saw with the publication of This Bridge Called My Back. Women from many different backgrounds, many different histories and stories came together to fight against the racism they were experiencing within the feminist movement in the 80s. The same here, right? This is about bringing together women from different ethnicities, different suffering different inequalities: sexism, racism, classism, sexual harassment, homophobia, etc., to fight for what they deserve as one. And so just to wrap this up, intersectionality is approached as this magical formula in which differences are not seen as a source of division and separation, but a source of empowerment. We can look at it as a form of unity. We are not unidimensional individuals. We are multidimensional, and we can find alliances with many people who also suffer the same discriminatory situations. So we can fight together embrace differences towards equality and opportunity. And actually, and because of that, because it provides a way to understand the multidimensional identities, and a way to understand that the policies and implementations also must be multidimensional. Intersectionality has been embraced both by the European Union. Here is included as within the European Institute for Gender Equality. It is actually implemented in the resolution of 22 for the very first time, understanding the importance of examining the intersection of multiple forms of discrimination, including roots from a gender perspective. I like more than the definition from women's rights and economic change, because, as I said, intersectionality is not just about discrimination, it's also about privilege, right? So I like this definition. I think it's more accurate. It reflects more how it is defined from gender women studies as an analytical tool for studying, understanding, and responding to the ways gender intersects with identities and other social categories, and how these intersections contribute to unique experiences of oppression and privilege. All right, so having reached this point of our presentation, I would like now to reflect how is it that we can contribute to the advancement of gender equality in our own disciplines and as students and as university professors. I am going to just briefly provide 2 examples. On the one hand, this is an innovation research project that we are developing within the research group STEAM, and it's called Transferable Skills for Students and Early Career Researchers. And we're focusing mainly on the development of critical thinking skills in a European framework in order to have an objective, contrasted, serious conversation as a society where gender discrimination comes from, because we can only tackle a problem when we understand its roots. And so we've been developing a basic manual to understand what are the basics of critical thinking skills in an interdisciplinary way, and build on a tradition of thinkers and educators. We propose that critical thinking in its most basic form could be articulated as the ability to express a contrasted opinion based on evidence and facts coming from reliable sources of information. And so my question reflection here has to do with us being able, as students, as professors, using historical and literary evidence. Are we able to explain where gender discrimination comes in the first place? I mean, have you ever thought about it? Everybody seems to have an opinion about gender equality or sexist language or different gender norms, but do people actually have a contrasted opinion about this? Do they have done research where all this comes in the first place? And of course, we need to situate experiences and in terms of countries and traditions. However, there is we can actually find some kind of pattern across the globe. So have you ever thought about it? Do you know where it comes from in the first place, using evidence coming from reliable sources? Okay, so the first thing as critical thinkers that we need to look for the evidence, right? So what is where these contemporary gender roles come from? So what kind of mentality is behind these gender roles, right? So the kind of mentality that we have at a European context is that all European societies are based on Judeo-Christian religions mentality. And this, the Judeo-Christian religious mentality has not been the result of peaceful adoption of these beliefs and norms. When we look at the historical evidence, Judeo-Christian religions were imposed in a very violent way, We can look at the evidence, not just of the holy wars and the crusades that took place for many, many centuries, but also when we look at the Inquisition as this European institution that perpetrated this imposition for 500 years. So we're talking that this mentality was not adopted peacefully and was not adopted through a short process. We're talking about many centuries. In the case of the Inquisition, from the 12th century all the way to the 18th century, 500 years of persecuting, murdering, burning, systematically killing those who did not adopt religious values. In the case of women in particular, most of these powerful women in their communities were turned into witches, were turned into evil creatures to justify their slaughter and their killing, right? So this is the first thing that we should understand, that the majority of our gender roles come from Judeo-Christian religious patriarchal mentalities, and is a mentality that has been imposed. Now, what is the evidence, right? What is the evidence that all these gender roles come from these religious Judeo-Christian mentalities? Well, so I'm going to look at how the most authoritative text, which is the Bible, defines and presents women, right? And so for a book that is supposed to be about love and tolerance, it contains an incredible amount of sexism. It makes repeated reference to how women should be subjugated to men, and how women are not entitled to equal rights. Let's just also remember that what I'm going to quote now has been used for centuries to justify women's discrimination, to justify killing and persecution of women, of witches, and basically to turn them into second-class citizens. So it really begins this sexism from the very beginning of the Bible, when we find in the Genesis that man is created first, which implies that he's more important, and also the fact that woman is created part of a small part of man's body, his rib. And the purpose and the objective of her creation is to be his assistant, to help him. So that is pretty sexist from the very beginning. That the fact, and also she's blamed as to be the sinful creature that is the cause of humanity's fall. Like Adam had nothing to do with that, right? But no, I mean, he's just innocent. She's blamed for that, and because she's blamed for that, he's given the power to, in Genesis 3:16, to rule over D, which means that man had rules over women just because there's their existence and because he's much more important. That is very clear, but mostly because she's sinful and he's not. Then also, and this is a very important reflection that everybody needs to understand, because it goes far beyond the fact that it's excluded out of the public domain, with all the consequences of that, because the public space is a space of the language, right? So the fact that women are banned from speaking in public also explains why there is sexist language. Women are not reflected in language because they cannot be in language, because language is a public space. Let me give you the evidence. In the first of the Corinthians 14:34-5, you find how they say, quote, "Let your women keep silence in churches, for it's not permitted for them to speak, but to be under obedience as following the law. And if they want to learn anything, they need to ask their husbands at home, for it's a shame to speak in the church." So women have no right to say anything, no right to learn anything. We need to be obedient, and we need to only ask husbands at home. This idea that we are banned from the public space is also in the first of the Timothy 2:11-5. Quote, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection, but it's offered not a woman to teach, not to usurp authority over man, but to be in silence." So this is a mentality that justifies that the role of women is in the private space, is at home, is not in the public, right? And we are subjected. And we don't have the right to teach anyone or to be as superior as men. We have to be silent, right? Then, of course, this idea of being submissive has to do, explains that wives, as the Ephesians say in 5:22:5, quote, wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord. For husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. So as we see, women are sinful creatures. Women have no voice. They can do anything. But men, they are equal to God. And that's why they are the head of the wife, because they are, that is what it says, that the wife is their possession, right? Is their property. Wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as it is fit in the Lord, it says Colossians. But for the woman which has a husband is bound for the law to her husband so long as he lives. She is her property, right? So, well, this idea that women are inferior, women have no voice, women cannot work in the public sphere, they only belong to home, and the private is very clear in the Bible. Also, another important reflection is not only that, that it became, everything that had to do with women's sexuality and women bodies was considered completely dirty, completely unclean. If a woman gives birth to a boy, she's unclean for 7 days. But if she gives birth to a girl, she's unclean for 2 weeks. So we find how we find how the fact that you're giving birth to a boy, that does make you less unclean than if you give birth to a girl. But just the fact that you are giving birth, which is a natural cycle, is a natural act by nature, is considered completely unclean. Also, this is reflected in women's menstruation. Patriarchal religions make everything that has to do with a women's body and sexuality completely unclean. But not only just women's body, by anyone who touches her. As it says here, during a woman's monthly period, a woman is unclean, but so is anyone who touches her. And also these, where is all these prejudices of how women should dress, or how women should behave? Well, you also see in the Bible that it's an abomination for a woman to wear clothes that men wear, right? That is in Deuteronomy 22:5. So as we can see here, the basic, if we want to provide a objective, a contrastive discussion of where all these gender roles come from in a European Judeo-Christian context, we need to understand that the basis is this distinction that is made between the public and the private, where women then does not belong to the public or only belongs to the private. Again, 1 Peter 3:1-3, ye wives, be in subjugation to your own husbands. This explains why, because you would say, well, yeah, all you're saying here is religious oriented and has nothing to do with democratic societies. But that is not true, because from a critical thinking point of view, when we look at the historical evidence, we see that the very first time in history that there is an articulation of democratic discourses is in the 18th century, right? Late 18th century. We find United States independence revolution, we find the French Revolution, and we see that the masterminds of this new social contract that translated into constitutions for countries is based in the same patriarchal rationale, in the same patriarchal sexist reasoning. Rousseau is one of the considered fathers of this social contract. It is also based on Locke, and not only wrote about the idea of citizenship and the idea about rights, but he also about education. And the proof is his work on Emile, or the education, where he describes what is the education of the ideal citizen of these new democratic societies. But he also describes his partner, what he calls Sophia. And as I said, they don't fight, and they don't fight against sexism in the old societies. They fight against classism, new order of class system, but they do not question this Judeo-Christian mentality. As they say, this is a quote from Emilio, which is translated, in which he provides the same articulation that I just mentioned about quotes from the Bible. Women are inferior, women do not have the right to speak in public, women belong to their husbands. As it says here, quote, women and men are made for one another, but their mutual dependency is not equal. It's not equal, okay? So the ones that are talking about liberty and freedom, they're not hypocrites. Because they completely have internalized that women and everything who's not the norm does not belong to the public language, to the public discourse, as we saw from the quotes, right? And belongs to the private. So of course, this discourse is completely can ignore women and everything who's not the norm, because they have internalized the Judeo-Christian mentality of public spaces and private spaces. And so men depend on women for his desire, but women depend on men because of their desires and their needs, right? This is very sexist, right? Men would survive more easily without women than they would do without us. This is the historical and the literary evidence that demonstrates the sexist patriarchal mentality that it was imposed by force for many, many centuries. When the articulation of democracy came, was not challenged, was completely reproduced by the fathers of the so-called social contract. And so this is also important in order to understand that gender discrimination is not just about sexist mentality. It's about reproducing historical injustices. And so, for example, and in that way, gender inequality is also the result of historical injustices. One example being the role of the French women played in the French Revolution. But when we talk about French Revolution, do we talk about women? No, women have completely silenced and made invisible in history and in education, which is so unfair and is so cruel and is so wrong, right? We know the story of Olympia de Gouges is not known by the majority of people. She fought at the front line of the French Revolution. She was a very famous person. She was a playwright, a writer, a philosopher, very active, and she wrote as a response to the sexism within the articulation of democratic discourses. She wrote as early as 1791, before Mary Wollstonecraft wrote the following year her Vindication of the Rights of Women. So this is a figure completely ignored. And the important thing about here is that she wrote the declaration in inclusive terms, and it's called the Declaration of the Rights of the Woman and the Female Citizen, right? What happened, of course, is that she was completely invisibilized. She was murdered. She was accused of treason without charges. So the whole story about the role that women have played in the pursuit of liberty and freedom has completely been ignored. So this is an important reflection also of critical thinkers. Okay, if I'm fighting against, if I want to advance gender equality, I also need to make sure we repair historical injustices, and we understand that the fight against, for example, representation in the language and in the public space, it is something that is being fought by many women and men along many, many centuries, especially her figure. The story of Olympia de Gouges also reminds us that to fight for gender equality is not just to improve material, health conditions, laws, but it's also to remedy historical injustices, and is to guarantee the recognition of women in public language, something that, as Olympia de Gouges in her Declaration of the Rights of the Female Women and Female Citizen have been pleading and vindicating with their lives, right? So this is also an important connection about critical thinkers. When we use a sexist language, which is the consequence of a patriarchal sexist mentality, even though we think that, well, using sexist language is not such a big deal. Using sexist language does not make me feel less of a woman. That is, the fact that you have these personal impressions is not going to change the historical injustice, and is not going to change the fact that sexist language comes from this particular set of beliefs that I've just proven to you. The belief that women have no voice in the public space, and all the different aspects that I'm going to review now. So please reflect on this. Sexist language, inclusive language is also a way to achieve gender equality. So when you are not using inclusive language, when you're using sexist language, what you're doing is that you are reinforcing the historical belief that women are inferior and their bodies and sexuality is filthy. You're also reaffirming the belief that women do not have a voice in the public sphere. You also saying that women belong to the private sphere, and also saying that women have a particular way of dressing and expressing that cannot just be free, right? And basically that women are submissive to husbands and parental patriarchal figures. This is what sexist language means, because this is where sexist language comes from. So this is one way we can reflect about this, being critical thinkers, having objective conversations where things come from, where things mean, right? Even though we are not aware of the meaning of a sexist language, for example, that doesn't change the fact that you are reinforcing these beliefs by saying sexist language. So, okay, just to finish then, I would like to also reflect on um, another way in which we, as university teachers, as students, faculty at large, we can help advance the development goal of the gender equality for all women and girls. This is a methodology that is called service learning, and we are establishing synergies between the Complutense University, the English Studies Department, and grassroots associations, in this case, La Incolora. And so this project offers curricular internships to students from English Studies degree at Complutense, giving free English classes by levels in a neighborhood association in Villaverde Alto as a support and a reinforcement to vulnerable families who cannot afford paying English classes for their children, or even also for adults. We are addressing boys and girls, but of course the special target is including making sure that all women and girls of this barrio have equal access to English classes. The district of Villaverde is included in the vulnerable index reports of Comunidad de Madrid, and is one of the most vulnerable neighborhoods in Madrid. A lot of, and especially after the pandemic, a lot of Spanish and immigrant families have been drastically hit. And the important aspect to bear in mind is that since 2004, Comunidad de Madrid and Spain is implementing bilingual programs in English, which means that a lot of subjects are taught in English. And so for us, it's important that, like social science, natural science, by providing all these extracurricular classes, reinforcement classes, we're making sure not only just advancing quality education for all children in the Barrio Villaverde, but especially women and girls that have equal access to English classes, and they can keep up in their schools. So this project of service learning is a methodological strategy that provides a mutual benefit, because at the same time that the students of the Complutense University can carry out their curricular internship and develop future competences, future professional competences, it allows to offer a free English course in the neighborhood. And so, as I said, we are promoting equal opportunities and inclusion, especially with the target of women and girls. And also with gender equality, gender development, advancing the gender equality development. We also make sure in this project that the material design and it does not reproduce gender stereotypes. We also make sure that the teachers are using inclusive language, and also by using technological devices, we are making sure that also that boys and girls have equal access to learning digital platforms. In these difficult times that we are experiencing with that pandemic, an initiative such as service learning, it really seeks to promote important values of solidarity, commitment to society, a sense of service to our community, while improving communication and professional skills. And really is trying to help our universities to be committed to the challenges of our societies, and especially to the sustainable goal number 5, achieve gender equality for all women and girls. These are just some, this is the way it was announced, the project, and then some, the material kit that we provide to students. And I've reached the end of my presentation on the developing goal number 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. It's been a pleasure for me to spend with you this time to reflect about the state of the development from a global perspective, a European Union perspective. Also, I hope you understand what intersectionality stands for a little bit more. Also, his historical roots, his conceptual roots, and why it's important to highlight that we need to empower all women and girls and talk in diversity and inclusive terms. And also, I hope I've given you some ideas in which we can help advance gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls from our own fields of study and disciplines, and just with the example of developing critical thinking skills, making sure that we guarantee an objective, contrasted discussion about the origins and how even though we have democratic societies, there is this Judeo-Christian mentality that is still permeates our societies, the way we relate, our norms, and even at the birth of all democratic discourses, these Judeo-Christian assumptions about how women should be and should behave have not been challenged. Well, we know that Judeo-Christian religions are still very important in a European context. So I think it's important to reflect how we can reconcile, right, that all these messages are there with democratic and gender equality for all. And just finally, the example of the service learning, which I think is a very empowering methodology and with a lot of potential to build bridges between the university and society at large. So, as I said, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and thank you very much for listening.